Have you ever trusted someone so deeply that you gave them everything only to realize they were the ones who pushed you off the edge? Have you ever believed the greatest loss of your life was death? Until you discovered that betrayal could come from someone still breathing. This is not a story of revenge. This is a journey of gathering the ashes of pain and turning them into strength. A widow, an unborn child, a lie carefully hidden by the very people she once called family. And then a truth that silences an entire room, not because it surprises, but because it exposes the rot painted over with the name family. If you've ever thought silence was weakness, this story will make you think again. Because sometimes the woman you assumed had already fallen is the very one who forces everyone to bow their heads before the truth. Have you ever felt like in just a single moment your entire world collapsed and you no longer knew who you were? That was how Claire Morgan felt on that autumn morning as she stood in the middle of the funeral home, dry-eyed staring at a cold urn instead of a casket. Ethan, the husband she had once believed would walk through life by her side, was gone in a horrific car accident. The car was burned beyond recognition, leaving no chance to open the casket, no last embrace, no final goodbye. At 32, Claire should have been planning a vacation to Greece, not choosing an urn with an oak lid. The weeks that followed were a blur: condolence calls, memorial services, the cold silence of the home they once shared. But what stunned Claire more than the grief of losing her husband was the sudden shift in her parents' behavior. Robert, her father, who used to dismiss her marketing job as nonsense, was now cooking soup for her every night. Linda, her mother, who had always fixated on praising her younger sister Sophie, now called her my sweet girl each time she hugged her. "We'll take care of everything for the funeral," her mother whispered, her voice as gentle as if she'd never been the one to constantly criticize Claire for being too stubborn. And Claire, with a shattered heart, believed this was a new beginning, that perhaps such profound loss could mend something long broken in her family. But maybe she was wrong, and the cost of that mistake would be a betrayal no one was ready to imagine. Growing up in a modest townhouse on the outskirts of Boston, Claire had never been the center of her own family's story. Every time she earned a scholarship, won a science fair, or received praise from a teacher, it was quickly overshadowed by an impromptu dance from Sophie, her half-sister on her mother's side, the one their mother lovingly called her little star. Claire wasn't jealous. At least that's what she thought. She simply learned how to stay quiet, how not to expect anything, and instead poured her energy into building a life on her own terms. After Ethan's death, those old memories unexpectedly returned, not through sarcasm or coldness, but through something Claire hadn't anticipated: affection. Each week, she found herself having dinner at her parents' house. Linda would cook the spicy roast Claire used to love, and Robert, her usually reserved father, suddenly started asking about her marketing job, listening as if he'd never dismissed it as frivolous. Claire began sending her parents financial support every month. $500 wasn't a small amount, but she didn't mind, because for the first time in her life she felt needed, seen, and loved unconditionally. She secretly thought that maybe tragedy had melted the layer of frost that had long coated their family. Maybe, in the end, loss could open a door she had always assumed was permanently locked. But in that fragile warmth, she had no idea a familiar old darkness was quietly returning, and this time it wouldn't just steal her sense of safety, but completely rob her of the trust she had only just begun to rebuild. On the third night of the 6th week, everything began to quietly fracture like a log splitting from the inside with no sound to warn anyone. Claire walked into her parents' house holding a box of homemade almond cookies, feeling lighthearted, grateful for the rare sense of peace these recent family dinners had brought her. But something was different tonight from the moment the door opened, and Claire saw Sophie standing there, one hand resting on her rounded belly. Her smile radiant and her presence consuming the entire room as if she had never been absent for the past 7 months. "Sweetheart, sit here. Let me grab some pillows for you. Are your feet sore?" Linda cooed, nudging Claire away from her usual seat like a misplaced puzzle piece. Robert poured wine for everyone, everyone except Claire, because she was the only one not pregnant and therefore unworthy of being doted on. Claire offered a faint, strained smile, poured herself a glass, and quietly listened as Sophie spoke about her prenatal yoga class and the OB/GYN, who's very famous, even delivered for a supermodel. Being overlooked wasn't new to Claire, but what hurt was how swiftly the feeling returned so brutally fast, as if all the affection and attention she had recently received were merely a pause between two tidal waves. She tried to interject with a gentle question. So, who's the baby's father? Do you plan to tell him? The room froze. Sophie put down her fork, her eyes suddenly cold. That's my business, she said. And then Linda, as if reading from a rehearsed script, added firmly, Claire, you shouldn't pry into your sister's private matters. Claire couldn't help but recall the time she underwent infertility treatments, how her mother constantly questioned her, pressured her, even handed her printed articles on IVF. But now that Sophie was pregnant out of wedlock, everything was suddenly sacred private and off limits. Claire couldn't pinpoint exactly why her chest tightened so painfully, but she knew this much: in the very house she once believed was her last refuge, she had once again become the outsider. And this time, it wasn't Ethan's absence that made her feel hollow, it was Sophie's dazzling return after Claire had thought she'd left her life for good. On Saturday morning, a light rain fell over Boston, the droplets trailing down the car window like a mournful melody. Claire held tightly onto two carefully wrapped gift boxes, a state-of-the-art baby monitor and a white knitted blanket she had spent nearly a month crafting by hand. Though her relationship with Sophie had always hovered between kinship and distance, Claire still attended the baby shower as a way to hold on to the last thread of decency amidst all that was growing unfamiliar. Her parents' house was filled that day with pink and blue balloons, ribbons, and scented candles. Guests laughed and chatted animatedly, embracing Sophie as though she were the leading lady in a coronation ceremony. Claire sat quietly by the window, forcing smiles and maintaining polite composure through the familiar games, belly-size guesses, due date predictions, and the most dreadful one identifying melted chocolate in diapers. When it was time to open gifts, Sophie played the role of the glowing, expectant mother, flawlessly cradling each baby item like a treasure, thanking every guest with sugary words. When she reached Claire's gift, she silently ran her fingers over the intricate pattern of the blanket, her eyes narrowing slightly as though measuring something deeper than material value. Then suddenly, Sophie stood up and gently tapped her glass of non-alcoholic wine. The room fell silent. Claire's heart pounded without reason. "Thank you all for coming today," Sophie began, her hand resting on her belly. "But there's something I want to share. Something I think it's finally time to say." Every eye turned to her, and then, as if each word were a blade, Sophie spoke clearly. "The father of the baby is Ethan Morgan." Claire froze. She didn't need any further explanation. Sophie's gaze locked onto hers like a victor awaiting the collapse of the defeated. The air thickened. A relative gasped. One of Sophie's close friends covered her mouth in disbelief. But what shattered Claire wasn't the shock on everyone's faces, it was the calm expressions on her parents. They had known. They had stayed silent. And they had let her walk into that room bearing a gift, knit by hands, trembling from grief, just to be the backdrop for a humiliating revelation. In that moment, Claire didn't just lose her husband. She lost her family, too. Claire couldn't quite remember how she left the party, only the sting of cold wind cutting through her thin jacket and her knuckles turning white from how tightly she gripped the steering wheel. On the drive home, everything played back like a chaotic film, in reverse: Sophie's gaze, that half smile like she'd just won some sick game, and Claire's own naive images thinking she was mending a family, being loved, being appreciated. When she arrived home, the key trembled in her hand, but she didn't cry. The pain had gone far beyond the threshold of tears. The next day, Sophie began texting dozens of messages, screenshots of affectionate conversations between her and Ethan, each word like a dagger. "I don't love her anymore. We'll tell her after the divorce. I only want to be with you." Everything Claire had ever believed crumbled piece by piece. The business trips Ethan used as excuses, the late-night urgent meetings, all were moments he spent giving his love to Claire's own sister. Even as Claire was injecting hormones trying to conceive a child with him, Ethan was whispering sweet nothings to Sophie in some unfamiliar hotel room. The breaking point came on Tuesday morning at exactly 7 a.m. when Claire's parents called. Not a word of comfort, not a single question about how she was feeling. Robert's voice was crisp and businesslike, as if chairing a board meeting. "Claire, you should do the right thing. Your nephew deserves a share of his father's legacy." Linda added, her tone softer but equally cold. "Don't let things get messy, sweetheart. Think of the family." Claire asked one question, only one, but it suffocated the entire space. How long have you known about them?" After a deadly pause, Linda whispered, "James told us. About 6 months before he passed." 6 months. 6 months of pretending to grieve, 6 months of accepting monthly support payments from the betrayed wife. Claire ended the call. Within less than a minute, she canceled all bank transfers, blocked her parents' number, blocked Sophie. The family she once cherished was gone, not because of a car crash, but because of the cold, calculated choices of those who shared her blood. And from that moment on, Claire was no longer the grieving woman seeking forgiveness. She became a warrior, silent, but ready to expose everything. Claire never imagined that hope could come from a stranger's voice on the phone. But that afternoon, as she sat numbly by the window, the phone rang, and a deep, melancholic female voice spoke. "Is this Claire Morgan? I'm Eleanor Brooks. I'm Ethan's mother." Claire froze. Ethan had always told her he was an orphan. He'd spoken of growing up in foster care, of lonely holiday seasons. All lies. Eleanor arranged to meet her at a small cafe in South End, a place where no one knew them, where secrets could fall into the air, thick with espresso without drawing attention. She sat there slender, her graying hair, neatly pinned eyes, carrying something both sorrowful and resolute. "I was at the funeral," Eleanor said. "I stood at the back. I saw you. But I couldn't say anything. I didn't want to cause more pain." Then she placed a worn yellow envelope in front of Claire. Inside were medical documents stamped clearly with Boston General Hospital's insignia. Claire scanned the familiar clinical phrases she had encountered in her battle with infertility: complete azoospermia, irreversible infertility, incapable of natural conception. Ethan had known. He had known since he was 25 and never said a word. All those months, Claire had bled from hormone treatments, blaming herself, believing she was the one unworthy of motherhood, had been nothing more than a cruel joke allowed to unfold in silence by the man she loved. And now, as Sophie wielded the child as leverage to claim Ethan's estate, Claire suddenly understood she was no longer just a victim. She held the one truth that could dismantle the entire lie. In court, Sophie played the part of the abandoned lover to perfection. She wore a simple black dress, held the baby in her arms, her tear-filled eyes casting her as though she had stepped straight from a tragic novel. "All I want is what's fair for my son," she choked out. But Claire didn't need to perform. Attorney Richard Martinez stepped forward and placed the hospital records on the judge's bench. "Your Honor, we have medical proof that Ethan Morgan was biologically unable to father a child." Silence blanketed the courtroom. Sophie erupted in panic. "Those documents are fake," she shouted, clutching the baby with trembling hands. But Martinez merely smiled and turned toward the back of the room. "We also have someone willing to submit a DNA test, Ethan's biological mother." Eleanor stood up. Claire's heart pounded. This wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a clean, sharp blade slicing through the elaborate performance. And for the first time since Ethan's death, Claire saw it clearly. She hadn't just lost him. She was reclaiming her life piece by piece with the power of the truth. That morning, the courtroom was packed. Curious glances and murmured whispers drifted like wind through the rows of old wooden benches. Claire sat in silence, gripping the hem of her dress, hearing only the sound of her own heartbeat, tight tense like a bowstring drawn to its limit. In the judge's hand was a sealed envelope containing the DNA test results, the final ticket to unravel a meticulously orchestrated lie. The results conclusively show, the female judge began, her voice ringing out as clearly as a bell. There is no genetic relationship between the minor child and Mrs. Eleanor Brooks. Therefore, it can be concluded that Ethan Morgan was not the father of this child. In that moment, the entire courtroom froze. The air grew thin, then instantly shattered with the sound of Sophie's muffled sobs. She buried her face, mascara smearing like a mask melting beneath the light of judgment. "I was scared," she stammered. "I didn't know who the father was. But when Ethan died, I thought no one would ever find out." She wasn't crying from remorse. She was crying because she'd been caught. And Claire's parents, Robert and Linda, finally wore the shock in full. They had been pawns in a con-wielding counterfeit affection to coerce Claire into surrendering what she rightfully deserved. The judge shook her head, her voice stern as a gavel about to strike. "Miss Thompson, you attempted to defraud this court and your own sister. If not for the restraint of the defendant, you would now be facing criminal charges." Claire didn't look at Sophie. She didn't need to. The truth had spoken. And the most valuable thing was that it came from the very system she once doubted justice. As she stepped out of the courthouse, Robert rushed to catch up. "Claire, please listen to me." Linda, eyes brimming, reached for Claire's arm. "We didn't know. We thought—" Claire turned, her gaze calm as a lake after a storm. Don't pretend you didn't know. You chose to believe her instead of me. And now, don't expect me to believe in you again." Then she pulled out her phone, and right in front of them blocked their numbers, each movement deliberate like a verdict needing no signature. Eleanor was already waiting outside, and when she gently asked, "Are you okay?" Claire simply smiled, the first real smile in months. "Not completely," she replied, "but for the first time after everything, I know I will be." 3 months after the trial, Claire stood by the window of her new apartment, a cup of chamomile tea in hand, quietly watching the sunlight stream through the glass panes. Early spring in Boston was gentle and serene, no longer the city of funerals and betrayal, but the place where she began again, not from nothing but from freedom. Messages from old relatives still surfaced now and then through acquaintances, a few apologies from her mother, some belated tears from her father, a long-winded letter from Sophie filled with phrases like, "I've changed," and "do it for the baby." Claire didn't read them. She folded them neatly and placed them in the bottom drawer of her desk, a place for things that no longer held value in the present but didn't yet need to be discarded. Each week she had dinner with Eleanor, two women who had been deceived by the same man in different ways but had found truth in one another. They shared stories of Ethan as a child, not to relive the pain, but to gently untangle knots in their memories, because someone imperfect could still have been part of a beautiful past if we learned to separate him from what he did. Claire cleared out the downtown apartment once shared with Ethan and handed the keys to Eleanor, a quiet gesture of gratitude. "I never thought I'd have a daughter," Eleanor whispered as she embraced, her eyes misty with emotion. Claire smiled, gentle yet unshakable, "And I never thought I could choose my family." She returned to work, not to forget, but to move forward. She joined a rock climbing club, planned her first solo trip to Iceland, a place she once dreamed of visiting with Ethan, but now would go for herself. Each morning she looked in the mirror and no longer saw the woman shattered by grief or abandoned by her family. She saw a new Claire Morgan, someone who didn't need anyone to validate her worth, who wasn't waiting for permission to begin again. Because sometimes the most beautiful life isn't the one you planned, but the one you fought to reclaim after everything has fallen apart. And when that happens, you don't just live, you truly begin to live. There are wounds that don't leave scars on your skin, but are etched deeply into memory betrayals that don't come from enemies, but from those you once called family. But what matters is not what you lost, but how you rose after losing everything. Claire didn't choose revenge. She chose truth. She didn't fight for an old love. She rebuilt her own worth. And you can do the same. If you've ever been abandoned, misunderstood, or underestimated, remember you're not alone. Hit follow to stay with us through more stories of bravery, heartbreak, and healing like this one. Because in a world full of false noise, sometimes it's the silence of truth that makes everyone listen.